The grand apocalyptic conflict that defined the twilight of the ancient world was not a sudden cataclysm, but a slow, grinding war of attrition, a final murderous embrace between two titans who had for centuries defined the very concept of empire. This was not a struggle for a border or a province. It was a war for the world itself, a generational contest of ideologies, faiths, and imperial wills that would leave both combatants so utterly broken, so completely drained of blood and treasure that they would be left defenseless before a storm they could not have possibly imagined. We have been conditioned to see history as a series of rises and falls, but we often fail to appreciate the sheer scale of a mutual annihilation, the vacuum created when the two pillars holding up the known world crumble simultaneously. Before we journey into this forgotten empire, make this exploration a shared one, like this video, and subscribe to join our circle of history seekers. The story of how one of the most brilliant civilizations of antiquity was seemingly erased from existence does not begin with its final conquerors. It begins decades earlier in the opulent palaces of the Sassanian capital of Ctesiphon, with a king whose ambition was as vast and as glittering as his treasury. His name was Khosrow II, and he would be the architect of his empire's greatest triumphs and its ultimate, irreversible doom. This is the story of the last great war of antiquity, a conflict of such unimaginable scale and ferocity that it bled the two most powerful empires on earth to the point of collapse, unknowingly setting the stage for the rise of a new faith from the desert that would sweep them both away and redraw the map of the world forever. This is the story of how the fire of ancient Persia was finally extinguished, a story of hubris, revenge, and the catastrophic birth of the medieval world. The final war between the Byzantine and Sassanian empires, the cataclysm that would ultimately pave the way for the Arab conquests, was ignited by an act of profound betrayal and a calculated exploitation of friendship. The Sassanian King of Kings, Khosrow II, owed his very throne to the Byzantine Emperor Maurice. Years earlier, when usurped by his own general, Bahram Choban, a young Khosrow had fled to Byzantine territory and thrown himself upon the mercy of his family's ancient rival. Maurice, in a stroke of brilliant geopolitical maneuvering, had provided Khosrow with the army needed to reclaim his patrimony. In return, the restored Persian king had ceded vast territories in Mesopotamia and Armenia, and for over a decade, an unprecedented peace and even a close personal friendship existed between the two rulers. For a brief moment, it seemed the centuries of bloody conflict had ended, with the Sassanian Empire now a junior partner, a client state to its Roman counterpart. This subordinate status, however, chafed at the pride of the Persian nobility and, most likely, at Khosrow himself. The peace, built on Persian humiliation, was a fragile one. The spark that ignited the inferno came in the year 602 CE. The Byzantine army, engaged in campaigns on the Danube frontier, mutinied against Maurice. The rebellion was led by a brutish centurion named Phocas, who marched on Constantinople, captured the emperor, and, in a display of shocking barbarity, forced Maurice to watch the execution of his own sons before he himself was beheaded. The news of his patrons' and friends' gruesome murder provided Khosrow II with the perfect casus belli, a pretext that was both a sacred duty and a golden opportunity. Declaring himself the avenger of Maurice, he rejected the legitimacy of the usurper Phocas and launched a full-scale invasion of the Byzantine Empire. This was to be no mere border skirmish. It was a war of restoration, a war of vengeance, and, in Khosrow's increasingly grandiose vision, a war to finally, definitively, and permanently destroy the Roman state. The initial Sassanian offensive was met with stunning success, a testament not only to the strength of the Persian military machine, but to the utter chaos that had engulfed the Byzantine Empire under the tyrannical and incompetent rule of Phocas. The Persian armies, led by brilliant and experienced generals like Shahbaraz and Shahin, systematically dismantled the Byzantine defenses in the east. The great fortress city of Dara fell in 624 CE, a bastion that had for decades anchored the Roman frontier. From there, the Persian advance was relentless. They swept into Roman Mesopotamia and Armenia, reclaiming all the territories Khosrow had been forced to cede years earlier. The Byzantine armies sent to stop them were repeatedly outmaneuvered and annihilated. The situation for the Byzantines was so dire that it triggered another internal collapse. In 610 CE, a new rebellion led by Heraclius the Elder, the exarch of Africa, succeeded in overthrowing the hated Phocas. His son, also named Heraclius, sailed to Constantinople and was crowned emperor, inheriting a state that was not merely at war, but in the advanced stages of disintegration. Heraclius came to power facing a situation that seemed utterly hopeless. The treasury was empty, the army was a broken and demoralized rabble, and the Sassanian war machine was continuing its inexorable advance, a force that seemed less like an army and more like a force of nature. Khosrow II, sitting in Ctesiphon, rejected Heraclius's desperate pleas for peace, viewing the new emperor as just another usurper. For the Persian king, the war was no longer about avenging Maurice. It was about achieving the ancient Achaemenid dream, a Persian empire that stretched from the Hindu Kush to the shores of the Aegean and the banks of the Nile. The war machine that Khosrow II unleashed upon the Byzantine world was the culmination of 4 centuries of Sassanian military evolution, a force perfected by the reforms of his grandfather, Khosrow II. At its core was the legendary heavy cavalry, the Savarin, composed of the elite Asadan nobility and the new class of state-funded Deccan knights. These were the Klibanari, or ovenmen, warriors so completely encased in lamellar and mail armor that they were virtually impervious to conventional weaponry. Both rider and horse were armored, creating a terrifying juggernaut of steel that functioned as the ancient world's equivalent of a main battle tank. Their primary weapon was the kontos, a long, heavy lance wielded with both hands, capable of punching through the shields and armor of Roman infantry formations. They were also armed with heavy swords, maces, and battle axes for close-quarters combat. The charge of the Sassanian cataphracts was a terrifying spectacle, a thunderous avalanche of metal designed to shatter the enemy's morale before contact was even made. Supporting these armored behemoths were vast numbers of skilled horse archers, drawn from the lighter cavalry units. These archers were masters of Parthian tactics, capable of firing powerful composite bows with deadly accuracy while on the move, harassing the enemy with swarms of arrows, luring them out of formation, and covering the advance or retreat of the heavy cavalry. This combination of heavy shock cavalry and mobile missile platforms gave the Sassanian army a tactical flexibility that was difficult to counter. But the Sassanian military of the early 7th century was more than just a cavalry force. They had learned from centuries of warfare with Rome and had developed a highly sophisticated logistical corps and a formidable siege train. They were masters of siege warfare, capable of constructing elaborate siege towers, battering rams, and complex mining operations to reduce the most heavily fortified Byzantine cities. Furthermore, Khosrow II's army was a truly imperial force, its ranks swelled by contingents from vassal states and allies, including highly effective infantry from the mountainous regions of Daylam and skilled Arab lancers from the Lakhmid kingdom. This vast, multi-ethnic and well-equipped force was organized for a long, grinding war of conquest, and in the first 2 decades of the conflict, it proved to be an almost unstoppable instrument of Khosrow II's will. The Persian advance continued, gaining a terrifying momentum as the 600 centuries dawned. Heraclius, struggling to consolidate his rule and rebuild his shattered armies, was powerless to stop the tide. In 611 CE, the Sassanian general Shahin swept into Syria and captured the great metropolis of Antioch, one of the 3 most important cities in the Byzantine Empire. Its fall was a devastating strategic and psychological blow. The next year, Damascus fell. The Byzantine defense of the Levant, which had held firm for centuries, had utterly collapsed. The most devastating blow, however, fell in 619 CE. The general Shahbaraz led his army south through Palestine and laid siege to the holy city of Jerusalem. After a bitter siege, the city was taken. What followed was a massacre. Christian sources claim that tens of thousands of the city's inhabitants were slaughtered. But the greatest act of desecration, an act of supreme psychological warfare, was the looting of the city's most sacred Christian relics, including the Holy Sponge, the Holy Lance, and, most precious of all, the true cross, the supposed physical remnant of the cross upon which Jesus was crucified. The true cross was carried off in triumph back to Saphon, not merely as loot, but as a symbol of the ultimate victory of the Zoroastrian faith over Christianity. The news of the fall and sack of Jerusalem and the capture of the true cross sent a shockwave of absolute horror and despair throughout the entire Christian world. It was seen as a sign of the apocalypse, a clear indication that God had abandoned the Byzantine Empire. The war was no longer just a geopolitical struggle. It had become a holy war, a clash of civilizations and faiths. Khosrow II had achieved an unimaginable triumph. He had not only defeated the Roman armies, he had humiliated their god. The moral collapse of the Byzantine Empire seemed imminent. The string of Sassanian victories had already been legendary, but the conquest that followed the fall of Jerusalem cemented the Sassanian Empire's position as the new, undisputed master of the East. In 619 CE, the general Shahbaraz achieved what no Persian commander since the Achaemenid Empire had managed. He invaded and conquered the province of Egypt. The loss of Egypt was a potentially fatal blow to the Byzantine state. Egypt was the empire's breadbasket, the primary source of the grain that fed the massive population of Constantinople. Its loss meant not only a catastrophic drop in state revenue, but also the very real threat of famine in the capital. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years since the conquests of Alexander the Great, a Persian army once again stood on the banks of the Nile, its authority extending over the ancient land of the pharaohs. While Shahbaraz was securing Egypt, other Sassanian armies were pushing deep into Anatolia, the strategic heartland of the Byzantine Empire. They captured key cities like Ancyra and even reached Chalcedon, a city directly across the Bosphorus from Constantinople itself. From their camps, Persian soldiers could gaze upon the glittering domes and impregnable walls of the Byzantine capital. The Roman Empire, the eternal rival, was reduced to a rump state, consisting of little more than the city of Constantinople, a few coastal strips of Anatolia, some islands, and its territories in North Africa and Italy. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now dominated by a resurgent Persian superpower. By 620 CE, the Sassanian Empire had reached its absolute territorial zenith. Khosrow II had succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of any of his predecessors. He had avenged his youthful humiliation. He had reclaimed every piece of contested territory, and he had effectively recreated the borders of the ancient Achaemenid Empire of Darius and Xerxes. from his magnificent palaces at Yazdegerd, surrounded by unimaginable wealth and luxury plundered from a dozen provinces, Khosrow II saw himself as the ruler of the world, the favored of the gods. His arrogance grew to legendary proportions. He styled himself as the universal king, and his sense of invincibility was absolute. He had broken the Roman Empire forever. He had captured its holy city, carried away its most sacred relic, and seized its richest provinces. The war was effectively over. All that remained was the final snuffing out of the flickering candle of Roman resistance in Constantinople. It was the darkest hour in the thousand-year history of the Roman state. The empire was shattered, its armies defeated, its spirit broken. The situation was so desperate that Emperor Heraclius seriously considered abandoning Constantinople and retreating to the city of Carthage in North Africa to regroup. The very survival of the Roman Empire, and with it the fate of Christendom, hung by the thinnest of threads. But it is in such moments of ultimate desperation that figures of historical greatness are forged. Heraclius, pushed to the very brink of annihilation, was preparing to unleash a counterattack so daring, so brilliantly unconventional, and so utterly unexpected that it would not only reverse the course of the war, but would change the course of history itself. The Sassanian triumph, seemingly so total and so permanent, was built on a foundation of hubris, a fatal overextension that would soon be brutally exposed. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, cornered in his capital and presiding over a shattered and bankrupt empire, spent the decade from 610 to 620 CE in a desperate struggle for mere survival. He had fended off internal plots, secured the city's food supply from his African provinces, and begun the slow, arduous process of rebuilding the Byzantine army from the ground up. He understood that a conventional frontal assault to reclaim the lost provinces was impossible. The Sassanian armies were too numerous, too well entrenched, and his own resources were too meager. He needed a new strategy, a bold, high-risk gamble that could strike at the very heart of the Sassanian war effort and shatter the myth of Khosrow II's invincibility. His plan was nothing short of genius. He would transform the war from a static defense of Byzantine territory into a highly mobile, holy war of retribution. To fund this desperate venture, Heraclius took a step that demonstrated the sheer gravity of the crisis. He made a pact with the Orthodox Church, led by the fiercely patriotic Patriarch Sergius. The Church agreed to loan the state its vast accumulated wealth, gold and silver plate, icons and treasures from every church and monastery in the capital, which was then melted down to mint new coins to pay for soldiers and equipment. This act transformed the nature of the war. It was no longer an emperor's political struggle. It was now a crusade, a sacred mission blessed by the Church to liberate Christian lands and, above all, to recover the stolen true cross. This religious framing was a masterstroke of propaganda, inspiring a new generation of soldiers with a fanatical devotion and a belief that they were fighting on the side of God. In the spring of 622 CE, leaving the defense of Constantinople in the hands of Patriarch Sergius and the general Bonus, Heraclius sailed from the capital with his newly forged army. He did not sail towards Syria or Egypt to confront the main Persian forces. Instead, he landed his army in Anatolia and marched into the mountains of the Caucasus. This was a brilliant strategic move. He was placing his army on the Sassanian Empire's northern flank, forcing the Persians to divert troops from their occupation of the rich southern provinces to deal with this new, unexpected threat. For several years, Heraclius conducted a series of brilliant campaigns in the rugged terrain of Armenia and the Caucasus. He was not focused on taking and holding cities, but on finding and destroying the Persian field armies. He drilled his troops relentlessly, creating a highly mobile force that could outmaneuver the larger, more ponderous Sassanian armies. He won a series of stunning victories, defeating Persian forces that were sent against him and demonstrating to his own soldiers that the dreaded enemy could, in fact, be beaten. These campaigns were a masterclass in grand strategy, a slow but steady process of bleeding the Sassanian military, disrupting their command structure, and building the confidence and experience of his own elite troops. While Heraclius was chipping away at Sassanian power in the north, Khosrow II, still supremely confident in his ultimate victory, decided to make his final move to end the war. He ordered a grand, coordinated assault on Constantinople itself. In 626 CE, a massive Persian army under his best general, Shahrbaraz, marched through Anatolia and once again encamped at Chalcedon, on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus. Simultaneously, a colossal army of the Avars and their Slav vassals, who were allies of the Persians, swept down from the Balkans and laid siege to the city from the European side. It was the ultimate pincer movement, a combined force that vastly outnumbered the city's defenders, designed to crush the Byzantine capital and finally decapitate the empire. The siege of Constantinople in 626 CE was one of the most pivotal moments in history. The fate of Western civilization arguably hung in the balance. The city was defended by a small garrison of around 12,000 soldiers, but they were bolstered by the fanatical devotion of the civilian population, who were inspired by the leadership of Patriarch Sergius. The city's greatest asset was its legendary defenses, the Theodosian walls, a triple-layered system of fortifications that was the most formidable defensive structure in the ancient world. The key to the siege, however, lay in the Bosphorus. The Byzantine navy, with its superior ships and its control of the waterway, completely prevented the Persians from crossing and linking up with their Avar allies. The Avars, despite launching massive and repeated assaults against the land walls, were unable to breach them. Their siege equipment was crude compared to that of the Persians, and every attack was repulsed with heavy losses. The climax of the siege came when the Avars attempted a combined land and sea assault. Their fleet of primitive dugout canoes was annihilated by the Byzantine navy, and a final, desperate infantry assault was bloodily repulsed. Having suffered catastrophic losses and with their morale broken, the Avars abandoned the siege and retreated back into the Balkans. On the other side of the Bosphorus, the Persian general Shahrbaraz could only watch in frustration. His elite army was useless, unable to participate in the battle. The failure to take Constantinople was a shattering blow to Sassanian prestige and a massive strategic defeat. The myth of their invincibility was broken, and the capital, the ultimate prize, had been denied to them. The psychological tide of the war had turned. The spectacular failure of the siege of Constantinople marked the beginning of the end for the Sassanian war effort. Khosrow II, in a fit of rage and paranoia, began to suspect his most capable general, Shahrbaraz, of treason for his failure to take the city. He sent secret orders to have the general executed, but the messengers were intercepted by the Byzantines, who promptly showed the orders to Shahrbaraz. The enraged general, realizing his king intended to murder him, effectively declared neutrality, withdrawing his powerful army from the conflict and refusing to obey any further orders from Ctesiphon. This act of rebellion deprived the Sassanian state of its best commander and its most experienced army at the most critical moment of the war. While the Sassanian command structure was fracturing, Heraclius was forging a powerful new alliance. He made contact with the Turkic tribes of the Caucasus, a new and formidable power that had recently emerged from the Central Asian steppes. Promising them vast amounts of plunder, he secured an alliance. and his Byzantine army was now reinforced by tens of thousands of fierce Turkic horsemen. With this massive combined force, Heraclius was ready to deliver the final decisive blow. In the autumn of 627 CE, he launched a daring invasion of Mesopotamia, the very heartland of the Sassanian Empire. Khosrow II, seemingly paralyzed by his own arrogance and isolated in his opulent palaces, struggled to scrape together a new army to defend his homeland. The new Persian army, led by the general Razad, finally confronted Heraclius's invasion force near the ruins of the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh. The Battle of Nineveh, fought in December 627 CE, was the climatic showdown of the entire 26-year war. The Byzantine army, hardened by years of campaigning and bolstered by its Turkic allies, won a crushing and absolute victory. The Sassanian army was annihilated, and its commander, Razad, was reportedly killed in single combat by Emperor Heraclius himself. The victory at Nineveh was total. There were no more Sassanian armies left to defend the heartland. Heraclius was now free to march wherever he pleased. He advanced south towards the Sassanian capital of Ctesiphon, looting the grand palaces of Khosrow II and Yazdegerd along the way. The Persian king, the great conqueror who had come so close to extinguishing the Roman Empire, was now a fugitive, fleeing from his own capital in panic and disarray. This spectacular, unbelievable reversal of fortunes was the final straw for the Sassanian nobility. They had grown to despise Khosrow II for his tyranny, his bottomless arrogance, and his refusal to consider peace during the years of victory, a decision that had now led them to ruin. A conspiracy of disgruntled generals and nobles led by Khosrow's own son, Qabad II, rose up against him. In early 628 CE, Khosrow II Pabis, the most victorious and ultimately the most disastrous of all the Sassanian kings, was overthrown, imprisoned in his own treasury, and after being forced to watch the execution of his favorite sons, was slowly put to death by archers. His fall was as swift and as brutal as his rise had been spectacular. The death of Khosrow II brought a great war to an immediate end. His son, Qabad II, immediately sued for peace with Heraclius. The terms were a complete Sassanian capitulation. Qabad agreed to withdraw all Persian forces from all conquered Byzantine territories, including Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, and Armenia. He agreed to release all Roman prisoners of war and to pay a large war indemnity. And, most importantly for the morale of the Christian world, he agreed to return the true cross. In 629 CE, Emperor Heraclius entered Constantinople in a magnificent triumph, the likes of which had not been seen in centuries. He rode into the city with the restored true cross held aloft, hailed not just as a Roman emperor, but as the savior of Christendom, a new Constantine, a new Alexander. The long, apocalyptic war was finally over. The Roman Empire had survived. It had, against all odds, won. But it was a Pyrrhic victory of the highest order. Both empires, the victor and the vanquished, were left utterly and completely exhausted. Their treasuries were empty. Their manpower was catastrophically depleted. Their most productive provinces had been ravaged by decades of total war, and their societies were traumatized and dislocated. They had fought each other to a bloody, bitter, and absolute standstill, creating a geopolitical power vacuum in the heart of the Middle East. And into that vacuum, a new, unforeseen power was about to emerge from the deserts of Arabia, a power that would sweep away the old world and consign the epic, centuries-long struggle between Rome and Persia to the annals of history. The peace treaty signed by Qabad II marked not a new beginning for the Sassanian Empire, but the start of its terminal agony. The new king's first act was one of brutal, paranoid self-preservation. To secure his throne from any potential rivals, he ordered the execution of all his brothers and half-brothers, effectively wiping out the entire male line of the House of Sassan. This act of dynastic slaughter, while securing his own short-term position, proved to be a catastrophic long-term blunder, as it created a crisis of succession from which the empire would never recover. Qadisiyyah II's reign was destined to be short and disastrous. Just a few months after taking power and ending the war, he died of a devastating plague that was sweeping through the western provinces of the empire, a plague likely exacerbated by the constant movement of armies and the breakdown of sanitation during the Long War. His death in late 628 CE plunged the Sassanian state into a vortex of chaos and civil war. The centralized, autocratic system that had been perfected by Khosrow I and ruthlessly wielded by Khosrow II required a strong, undisputed monarch at its center. Without a clear and accepted heir, the entire state apparatus fractured. The empire's most powerful figures, the great regional nobles, the commanders of the various army factions, and powerful figures at the royal court began to fight amongst themselves for control of the crumbling state. In the 4 years that followed Qadisiyyah II's death, from 628 to 632 CE, the throne of Ctesiphon became a revolving door of pretenders and puppets. At least a dozen different rulers claimed the title of King of Kings, none of them able to establish any lasting authority. The most notable of these claimants were two daughters of Khosrow II, Purandokht and Azarmidokht, who reigned briefly, a testament to the sheer desperation and lack of male heirs. Even the great general Shabaraz, the conqueror of Egypt, briefly seized the throne for himself, murdering the child king Yazdegerd III before he himself was assassinated just 40 days later. This period of intense internal strife was the death knell of the Sassanian Empire. The civil war was not just a political struggle, it was a complete societal collapse. The great professional army, the Savaran, which had been the bedrock of Sassanian power, disintegrated into private militias, loyal only to their own ambitious commanders. The intricate system of dams and irrigation canals that made the Mesopotamian heartland so fertile fell into disrepair, leading to widespread famine and economic ruin. The tax collection system broke down, leaving the state with no revenue. The authority of the central government evaporated, and the empire effectively devolved into a collection of warring fiefdoms. The Sassanian Empire was a hollowed-out shell, a magnificent tree rotted from the inside, waiting for a final push to topple it. It was at this moment of absolute, unprecedented weakness that the storm that had been gathering in the south finally broke. The Arab tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, recently unified by the new and dynamic faith of Islam, erupted onto the world stage. Driven by a potent combination of religious fervor, economic necessity, and a brilliant new form of mobile warfare, they began to launch raids into the southern territories of the Sassanian Empire. Initially, these were likely seen by the feuding Persian nobles as little more than a nuisance, another group of desert raiders to be dealt with once the more important business of the civil war was settled. They could not have been more wrong. These were not mere raids, they were the probing attacks of a disciplined, highly motivated, and strategically brilliant new superpower. The initial Arab incursions met with a disorganized and feeble resistance from the fractured Sassanian military. Local garrisons were isolated and destroyed. The Arab armies, under the command of brilliant tacticians like Khalid ibn al-Walid, moved with the speed and fluidity that the ponderous, heavy cavalry-based Sassanian forces found impossible to counter. They used the desert as a vast ocean, appearing suddenly to strike at vulnerable points before melting back into the sands, where the heavily armored Persian armies could not follow. The final, desperate attempt to restore order to the dying Persian state came in 632 CE, with the coronation of Yazdegerd III, a young grandson of Khosrow III who had been hidden away during the years of chaos. He was the last king of the House of Sassan, a tragic, doomed figure who was destined to preside over the final dissolution of his 400-year-old ancestral empire. Ascending to the throne in the ancient Zoroastrian center of Istakhr, far from the chaotic capital of Ctesiphon, Yazdegerd III represented the last hope of the traditionalist Persian aristocracy. He desperately tried to rally the feuding noble houses, to appeal to their sense of shared history and common danger, and to reconstitute the shattered imperial army. But it was far too little and far too late. The bonds of loyalty and the centralized structure that had held the empire together for 4 centuries had been irrevocably broken by the war with Byzantium and the subsequent civil war. The great nobles paid lip service to the new king, but they were primarily concerned with preserving their own power and their own lands. The Sassanian Empire was no longer a unified state. It was a loose, fractious confederation facing a unified, disciplined, and divinely inspired enemy. The decisive confrontation between the rising power of Islam and the dying empire of Persia would take place on the plains of Mesopotamia, the province the Sassanians called Dil-e-Iranshar, the heart of Iran. The Arab armies of the Rashidun Caliphate, under the overall command of the Caliph Umar in Medina, were now engaged in a full-scale invasion, not just a series of raids. Yazdegerd III and his advisors knew that if Mesopotamia fell, the empire was finished. They gathered together all the remaining military strength of the empire, a final grand army drawn from every corner of the realm, a force that represented the last flowering of the Sassanian military tradition. At the head of this army was placed the most powerful noble in the empire, Rostam Farrokhzad, the military governor of Khorasan. The fate of the Sassanian world now rested on his shoulders. The Sassanian army that Rostam Farrokhzad led to confront the Arab invasion was, on paper, a formidable force. It vastly outnumbered the Muslim army, perhaps by a factor of 3 or 4 to 1. It was composed of the remnants of the elite Savran heavy cavalry, large bodies of infantry, and, in a display of ancient Persian military tradition, a contingent of war elephants intended to terrorize the Arabian horses and break the enemy infantry lines. The army was a magnificent, glittering spectacle, a physical embodiment of the ancient power and glory of the King of Kings. But it was an army plagued by deep systemic weaknesses. Its leadership was divided, with the great nobles who commanded its various contingents jealous of one another's authority and of Rostam's supreme command. Its morale was low, shaken by years of civil war and the constant string of defeats that local garrisons had already suffered at the hands of the Arabs. And its tactics, based on the ponderous charge of heavy cavalry and the deployment of static infantry blocks, were outdated and ill-suited to counter the fluid, rapid strike tactics of their opponents. On the other side, the Arab Muslim army, led by Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, was everything the Sassanian army was not. It was smaller, more lightly equipped, and lacked the fearsome heavy cavalry and elephants of the Persians. But it was unified by a single, powerful faith that promised paradise to those who fell in battle. Its soldiers were hardy, accustomed to the harsh conditions of the desert, and utterly devoted to their commanders. And they were tactically brilliant, using their light cavalry and infantry in coordinated attacks, exploiting their superior mobility, and maintaining a level of discipline and cohesion that the fractious Persian host could no longer muster. The stage was set for the final, decisive battle that would determine the fate of Persia. In the year 606 CE, on a dusty plain near the town of Al-Qadisiyyah, Not far from the ancient ruins of Babylon, the two armies met. The battle that followed was not a swift, one-sided affair, but a brutal, grinding, multi-day struggle that raged for 3 days and 4 nights. It was a clash of two worlds, a struggle between an ancient, hierarchical, aristocratic empire and a young, dynamic, egalitarian faith. On the first day, the Sassanian war elephants proved devastatingly effective, panicking the Arab cavalry and threatening to break the Muslim lines. The Arab infantry, however, held firm, their discipline and courage preventing a rout. Over the next 2 days, the battle devolved into a savage series of charges and countercharges, a bloody stalemate in which both sides took heavy casualties. Rostam, directing the battle from a raised throne at the center of his army, threw his best units into the fray, confident that the sheer weight of his numbers would eventually prevail. The turning point of the battle, and indeed of the history of Persia, came on the 4th day. As the fighting reached its peak intensity, a massive sandstorm erupted, a common occurrence in the region. But this was no ordinary storm. The fierce winds blew directly from the west into the faces of the Sassanian soldiers, blinding them with dust and sand, tearing at their elaborate banners and disrupting their formations. For the Arab Muslims, with the wind at their backs, it was a miracle, a clear sign of divine intervention, the very hand of God striking down their enemies. In the chaos of the storm, the Arab forces launched an all-out assault. The Sassanian lines, already disoriented and demoralized by the wind, began to crumble. The climax of the battle, according to tradition, came when a small group of Arab warriors fought their way to the Sassanian command center. In the confusion, Rostam Farrokhzad, the commander-in-chief of the Persian army, was killed. The news of his death spread like wildfire through the Persian ranks, and what had been a wavering line collapsed into a full-scale, panicked rout. The defeat at Qadisiyyah was not just a lost battle, it was a mortal wound from which the Sassanian Empire would never recover. The main Sassanian field army, the last great hope of the dynasty, had been utterly annihilated. The rich province of Mesopotamia, the economic and administrative heart of the empire, now lay completely defenseless. The road to the capital, Ctesiphon, was wide open. The victorious Arab army advanced swiftly, brushing aside what little resistance remained. King Yazdegerd III, upon hearing the catastrophic news, gathered his court and the royal treasury and fled from his capital, heading east towards the relative safety of the Iranian plateau. He was abandoning the city that had been the heart of Sassanian power for over 400 years. Shortly thereafter, the Arab armies entered Ctesiphon. They were reportedly stunned by the sheer wealth and luxury of the city, by the grand arches of its palaces and the richness of its treasures. The capture of the Sassanian capital was a moment of immense symbolic and strategic importance. It signaled the end of an era. The heart of the empire had been ripped out. The house of Sassan, which had once ruled from the Nile to the Oxus, was now a dynasty in exile, its king a fugitive in his own collapsing realm. The fall of Ctesiphon was not the end of the war, but it was the end of the Sassanian Empire as a functioning superpower. From his refuge on the Iranian plateau, Yazdegerd III made one last desperate attempt to rally the remaining forces of his empire. He was able to gather a final grand army drawn from the eastern provinces that had not yet been touched by the Arab invasion and from the remnants of the forces that had escaped the disaster at Qadisiyyah. This was to be the final stand, a last gamble to drive the invaders out of the Mesopotamian heartland and restore the fortunes of the empire. The Sassanian High Command chose a strategic location in the Zagros Mountains at a place called Nahavand to make their stand. The mountainous terrain would, they hoped, negate the superior mobility of the Arab cavalry and give their own heavy infantry a defensive advantage. Here, in 642 CE, the final major battle between the Rashidun Caliphate and the Sassanian Empire took place. The Battle of Nahavand was, if anything, an even more catastrophic defeat for the Persians than Qadisiyyah had been. The Arab commanders, using a clever feigned retreat, lured the Sassanian army out of its strong defensive positions and onto the open plain. Once the Persians were drawn into the trap, the main Arab army turned and attacked, completely surrounding and annihilating the Sassanian force. The defeat at Nahavand was the final, irreversible blow. The Arab sources would later refer to it as the Fath al-Futuwah, the victory of victories, because it completely and utterly destroyed the last vestiges of organized Sassanian military power. The Iranian plateau, the very homeland of the Sassanian dynasty, now lay open and defenseless. The Sassanian Empire, as a political and military entity, had ceased to exist. What followed was not a swift conquest, but a slow, piecemeal process of subjugation that would last for several decades. The Arab armies fanned out across the vast Iranian plateau, conquering it province by province, city by city. Many cities and regions put up fierce local resistance, led by members of the old Sassanian nobility, the Dekhwans, who fought to preserve their lands, their power, and their ancient faith. But this resistance was uncoordinated and localized. Without a central army or a unifying king to lead them, they were eventually overcome one by one. The story of the Sassanian Empire's final decade is the story of its last king, Yazdegerd III. His life became a desperate, decade-long flight from the advancing Arab armies. He fled from one city to another, from Ray to Isfahan, from Istakhr to Kerman, and finally to the remote northeastern province of Khorasan, the very edge of his former empire. He was a king with no army, no treasury, and no kingdom. A tragic figure desperately trying to rally support for a cause that was already lost. He sent desperate embassies to the Tang Emperor of China, pleading for military assistance to reclaim his throne, but the aid never came. The local governors and nobles of the eastern provinces, while perhaps sympathetic to his plight, were unwilling to risk their own positions by engaging in a hopeless war against the seemingly invincible Arab armies. His presence became a liability, a magnet for the attention of the Arab conquerors. The final, ignominious end came in 651 CE near the city of Merv, in what is now modern-day Turkmenistan. Yazdegerd III, the last king of kings, the heir to Cyrus and Darius, to Ardashir and Shapur, was not killed in a glorious last stand against his enemies. Instead, while hiding in disguise, he was murdered by a local miller who sought to steal the king's purse. It was a pathetic and tragic end to a 400-year-long epic. The death of Yazdegerd III was the final punctuation mark at the end of the Sassanian story. There was no longer a king, no longer an army, and no longer an empire. The fire that had been kindled by Ardashir I on the plain of Hormozgan in 224 CE had finally been extinguished by the waters of a new faith and a new empire. The lands of Iranshar were now incorporated into the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate, and its people, over the course of the next several centuries, would gradually begin to convert to the new religion of Islam. The long twilight of the ancient world had finally given way to the dawn of a new medieval world, a world that would be built upon the ruins of the two great rival empires that had, in their final suicidal embrace, fought each other to their mutual destruction. The conquest of the Sassanian Empire by the armies of the Rashidun Caliphate was not merely the end of a dynasty, it was the end of an entire civilizational epoch. It brought to a close a continuous thread of ancient Iranian history culture, and religious tradition that stretched back for over a millennium to the time of the first Persian Empire of Cyrus the Great. The title of this narrative asks how Islam erased the Sassanian Empire, and on the surface, the erasure seems total. A ruling dynasty of 4 centuries was eliminated. The state religion, Zoroastrianism, which had been intrinsically linked to the identity of the empire, was displaced and driven to the margins, eventually surviving only in small, isolated communities or in exile. The very political independence of Persia was extinguished, its vast territories absorbed into a new Arabic-speaking Islamic caliphate. For the first time in its long history, Persia was to be ruled by a foreign power that was not from a neighboring, culturally similar civilization like the Greeks or Parthians, but by a people from a completely different cultural and linguistic world. And yet, to claim that the Sassanian legacy was simply erased is to fundamentally misunderstand the subtle and complex nature of cultural transmission. The empire was conquered, but its highly sophisticated civilization was not destroyed. Instead, it underwent a profound process of absorption, transformation, and ultimately transmission, becoming one of the most crucial and foundational pillars of the very Islamic civilization that had conquered it. The most immediate and tangible Sassanian legacy was in the realm of statecraft and administration. The Arab conquerors were brilliant soldiers and charismatic leaders, but they had little to no experience in governing vast, complex, urbanized, and agrarian societies. Faced with the challenge of ruling their enormous new empire, they wisely chose to adopt the sophisticated Sassanian bureaucratic and administrative machinery almost entirely. Sassanian systems of taxation, the land survey, kharaj, the poll tax, jizya, imposed on non-Muslims, and the intricate workings of the government ministries, diwans, were maintained for centuries after the conquest. Persian bureaucrats, scribes, and administrators who had converted to Islam but retained their cultural and professional heritage became indispensable figures in the courts of the Umayyad and, even more so, the Abbasid Caliphates. The entire structure of the great Abbasid court in the newly founded capital of Baghdad, just a stone's throw from the old Sassanian capital of Ctesiphon, was a direct inheritance from Sassanian practice. The powerful office of the vizier-wazir, the elaborate court etiquette, the styles of royal dress, and the political theory of an absolutist, divinely ordained monarchy were all Sassanian in origin. In essence, the new Islamic empire learned how to be an empire from its Sassanian predecessors. In the military sphere, the Sassanian model of elite heavy cavalry continued to exert a powerful influence. The tactics, armor, and weaponry of the Sassanian sovereign were adopted and adapted by the armies of the caliphate, particularly in the eastern provinces. The ideal of the mounted warrior aristocrat, the code of chivalry, Jawan Mahdi, and the cultural importance of the royal hunt, all central to the Sassanian noble identity, endured as powerful cultural tropes within the new Islamic society, shaping the development of martial traditions throughout the medieval Islamic world. The cultural and artistic impact of the Sassanians was perhaps even more profound and lasting. The Persian language, though temporarily overshadowed by Arabic as the language of religion and high administration, never disappeared from common use. It underwent a period of transformation, absorbing a vast amount of Arabic vocabulary, but retaining its core Iranian grammar and structure. By the 10th century, it re-emerged as New Persian, written in the Arabic script, and became the vehicle for one of the world's great literary traditions. The stories, myths, and historical legends of Sassanian Iran were not forgotten. They were meticulously preserved and celebrated by poets like Ferdowsi, whose epic masterpiece, the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, is a loving and heroic retelling of the pre-Islamic history of Iran. This work did more than just preserve the old tales. It effectively preserved the Persian language and cemented the memory of the Sassanian kings. Figures like Ardashir, the unifier, Shapur the conqueror, Bahramgur the hunter, and especially Khosrow I Anushirvan, the just philosopher, king, as the archetypal models of Iranian kingship. In the visual arts and architecture, Sassanian motifs and principles became foundational elements of Islamic art. The iconic winged crowns of the Sassanian kings, the royal hunting scenes, the highly stylized depictions of flora and fauna, and the symbol of the confronted beasts all found their way into the artistic vocabulary of the Islamic world, appearing on ceramics, textiles, and metalwork. Sassanian architectural innovations, such as the use of the grand barrel vault known as the Iwan and the dome on squinches, which allowed a circular dome to be placed over a square room, became defining and ubiquitous features of mosque, palace, and madrasa architecture across the entire Islamic world, from Spain to India. The most significant and perhaps most abstract Sassanian legacy, however, was the very idea of Iran itself. It was the Sassanians who, more than any dynasty before them, had consciously forged a national identity based on a shared territory, Iranshar, a shared religion, Zoroastrianism, and a shared historical narrative that heroically linked them back to the Achaemenid Golden Age. Even after the Sassanian state was dismantled and the majority of its people had converted to Islam, this powerful sense of a distinct Iranian cultural, linguistic, and historical identity endured. It was this remarkable resilience that allowed Persian culture to experience a great renaissance within the broader Islamic Caliphate, creating a unique and brilliant synthesis of Islamic faith and Persian civilization that would profoundly shape the future of Iran and all its neighbors. The Sassanian Empire, therefore, was not truly erased. It was conquered, and its state and religion were overthrown, but its spirit proved to be indestructible. It stands as the great bridge connecting the ancient Iranian world to the medieval and modern one. For 4 centuries, they were the guardians of a civilization thousands of years old. They fought the Roman Empire to a standstill, created a society of immense wealth and stability, and fostered a culture of extraordinary artistic and intellectual richness. Their final, tragic story is an epic of incredible triumph and catastrophic collapse. But in their fall, they bequeathed a legacy of statecraft, culture, language, and most importantly, identity that would not only survive the conquest, but would go on to shape and enrich the very civilization that had conquered them. They were the last fire of ancient Persia, a fire that was extinguished in a storm of conquest, but whose embers continued to glow with a fierce and enduring light, illuminating the new world that was built upon their ashes.